I'm joined by Pam Palmater in Toronto. Pam is the chair in Indigenous governance at Ryerson University. She's also a lawyer. In Ottawa, Calvin Lawrence, a retired RCMP and Halifax police officer with 36 years of experience in policing. Calvin retired in 2006, and he retired early partly because he says he was consistently the target of racist behavior from his colleagues. He released a book about it in 2019 called Black Cop: My 36 Years in Police Work and My Career-Ending Experiences with Official Racism. Calvin, I'm going to start with you tonight as a former police officer. What do you make of how the RCMP is reacting to the charge that it suffers from systemic racism?
Well, in 2008, there was a case where systemic racism was confirmed in the Tamafor case. Now, if he's getting almost $2 million, and the commission is saying that there's systemic racism, then the meaning and the fact that it's there is a non-starter.
Pam, I'll give the same question to you. What do you make of how the RCMP, in particular the commissioner, is reacting to the idea, the concept of systemic racism inside the RCMP?
Well, I don't think she's really veered very far from her original statement, which was essentially a denial of systemic racism, because look at how she defined it. So the first time she's talking about, there's no systemic racism, but maybe an unconscious bias. Now she defines systemic racism as unintended barriers. So there's no real acknowledgement of the racialized violence and brutality and killings of Black and Indigenous peoples, but maybe there's some institutional structural issues that we'll try to deal with moving forward. So it's not really that much of a difference.
Pam, I know you spent a lot of time teaching about this and talking about this. Mm-hmm. What is systemic racism? What does it mean? What does it look like?
Well, racism is a whole variety of things, but systemic racism, you're talking about laws, policies, practices, institutions, funding structures that perpetuate racism or discrimination based on race or sex, that kind of thing. But when people talk about systemic racism, they like to point to a law like the Indian Act or, some kind of policy. But those things are pieces of paper. They're all implemented and interpreted and put into practice by people. So the most critical thing that we should be talking about here is really the racism by everybody that works at the RCMP, in terms of staff people, in terms of leadership, in terms of RCMP officers on the ground, and all of those mechanisms, which are the things that actually kill Black and Native people. It's not their policies that kill Black and Native people. It's actually individuals with very racist ideologies that kill Black and Native people.
Let's talk about the arrest of Chief Adams. Calvin, have you seen the video?
I've seen the video.
And when you look at that video, as a former police officer, what do you see?
Okay, I've sent a number of questions to a number of reporters, and the trouble I have with some of these videos, other than the Garner case, you don't see it from the first to the end. Because I was a use of force instructor in Regina, I view it with a critical eye. So I kind of pick it apart and I say, okay, now, he was very agitated. He challenged them to fight, but I don't think he really wanted to fight with them. So if the police officer says, is there anything I can say or anything that you can suggest that would get you to cooperate? I hope to think there is, that we ought to go through a fight. Now, that would de-escalate the situation, because what a police officer should be looking for is voluntary compliance through verbal intervention. The other thing that I saw was where the member charged and knocked him to the ground. I don't think that was necessary. And what people don't talk about, what the courts don't question, you have a use of force continuum, which is a guide, and it should be a guide that I could explain sometime, but not at the time. It's a guide. And if police officers are made to answer in relation to that use of force continuum, you would get to the truth. You would get whether or not they were way off the mark or whether they were close to the mark. And every police officer has to know and be able to interpret, RCMP officer, and interpret that.
They have to know how to de-escalate.
Well, it's not only de-escalate; it's use of force model. When do you use your baton? When do you use your gun? The behaviors of individuals, and this is a guide because this differs.
And
but until they start talking in these terms, it's just talk.
And for you, watching that video, do you think that they did enough to de-escalate the situation?
No, I think that they had a number of opportunities to de-escalate it, and the person that came in, or the member that came in charge and knocked him to the ground, was not called for based on the fact of the ability of the individual and the ability of the police officers and the number of police officers.
Right.
And this is what you make your judgments on in use of force.
Okay. Pam, when you look at that video of Chief Adam, what do you see?
Well, I see a 60-year-old man, a First Nation chief, who has had numerous life experiences like us with police racism and harassment, yet again being confronted by multiple police officers, heavily armed, much younger, much bigger than him. And yeah, of course, he has every right to be agitated. He has every right not to challenge what it is that they're asking him to do. But he was unarmed. He didn't threaten to kill anyone. He wasn't in the act of causing anyone any physical safety or any police officer safety. He was already detained. And for that officer to come running, tackling him and leave him bloody and bruised was absolutely not just excessive force.
Okay.
That's called gratuitous violence, when you do it for the sake of violence and not because it's necessary in the situation.
I want to bring up with you and read part of a statement from the National Police Federation that was released today. It's the RCMP's bargaining unit, and the statement is specifically about the Wood Buffalo RCMP and the arrest of Chief Adams. And it reads in part, "The National Police Federation and its membership are gravely concerned regarding the public vilification of the Wood Buffalo RCMP members involved in this incident. Traffic stops are some of the most dangerous duties done by police. The unknowns of who the driver or passenger is, their background and intentions, as well as what may be contained within a vehicle, are all risks. Speculation and supposition based on one perspective or one piece of evidence, such as a video, risks undermining not only the investigation, but our members' ability to effectively serve their communities." Calvin, let me come to you. What do you think of that statement? Do you agree with it?
Well, they're talking about a lot of things that have nothing to do with that particular incident. Every incident of use of force has to be examined on their own merit. Every incident. So if they were going to explain the behavior, I would challenge them to explain the behavior using the use of force model. If they're going to explaining things the way they're explaining it now does not hold individuals accountable for their conscious actions with the information that they had.
Pam, what do you make of the statement from the National Police Federation that this is one of the most dangerous things that a police officer can do?
So then what? That gives them a blank check for unfettered violence against everyone they meet, keeping in mind that they racially profile and racially target Black and Indigenous peoples across this country. So we're supposed to bear the risks and the violence of their risky traffic stops. I mean, come on. It was an expired license. He was already out of the vehicle. He was clearly unarmed. They knew exactly who he was. I mean, there was no risk to life there. He was already detained before he was tackled by that officer. And And their statement is in line with what every other police union and police chief's statement always is. You never see them coming forth and saying, what a horrific excessive use of force that was. They've already made their determination that according to RCMP values and rules, that's okay. And that's exactly what we need to be concerned about. That if they think that's okay, that's why it's okay in Nunavut to brutalize people. That's why it's okay in BC to brutalize people. That's why it's okay for this to happen across the country, because their unions and federations always stand in defense of them instead of trying to call out those who hurt people and make their police forces safer for everybody involved.
Calvin, what do you think? Because to be fair to the Federation, they are saying they want a fair hearing for these police officers. What do you say? What do you think the answer is here?
Well, at some point, whether it be the case in Minneapolis or this case, it's going to end up in the courts. And when you go to court, you get justice according to law. You don't get justice, and this is what a lot of citizens don't understand: justice according to law. So therefore, again, I examine this with a critical eye, and I kind of dismiss what the Federation is saying, because we have one incident. Let's look at this incident.
Well,
traffic stops, yes, are dangerous, but that's nothing to do with this one incident.
Well, let me just, on this point, you brought up the issue of George Floyd. Calvin, a lot of this desire and demand for change is coming from the George Floyd situation in the United States. I wonder, why did it take an American man to ignite this fire here and not the story of the Chief Adams or the story of Dale Culver in BC, which is a lot in common with George Floyd's story, or your story, Calvin Lawrence? So many stories here that could have ignited this. Why did it take an American man's experience to ignite this here? Calvin, I'll ask you first.
I think that prolonged torturous abuse hit a lot of people. And I think that the process of holding individual police officers accountable does not happen. It just doesn't happen. We are living where police officers practice white supremacist behavior and white behavior. The police officers who practice white supremacist behavior wish to maintain and control dominance over people classified as non-white. The white police officers are simply doing their job and living up to their oath. This is where the difference is never explained. It's never talked about in the terms that I'm using now. We have Black Lives Matter. We have anti-Black racism. We have Idle No More. But what I'm saying, if you want to go right to the issue, you have people who are practicing white supremacist behavior and white behavior, and the difference is deception. Remove deception. You don't need a 2-week course on racism. Just remove deception.
Pam, last word to you on this. Why do you think it took an American experience to light a fire here?
Because Canadians just don't want to believe it. Canadians have a long history of glorifying Canada as multicultural, as human rights loving, really looking the other way when it comes to murdered and missing Indigenous women, the over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples, police brutality and violence, and pointing anywhere else. The United States is the closest place, so they often point down there. Thank goodness we're not as bad as them, when in fact we are. It's just the lives of Black and Indigenous peoples here in Canada aren't on the radar. They're undervalued. I mean, we've had a national inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls that found Canada guilty of genocide, purposeful, intentional genocide of Indigenous women and girls. And where are we now? We're a year later and Canada doesn't even have a plan for that. So that just shows you how really undervalued Indigenous and Black lives are here in this country. And very thankful for these protests because they're bringing to light, and the media as well, digging and bringing to light how much this happens here in Canada too.
What could the Prime Minister, he's promised to do things, what could he do? We have about a minute left. Calvin, what could be the first thing that he could do that would convince you that, or what's the first thing that could be done? Let's not put it entirely on his shoulders, could be done to show people that we're serious about this?
Very simple. Hold individual police officers accountable for their behavior. Don't
They're not
form
now?
committees. Pardon me?
They're not now?
No, they're not holding individuals accountable for their behavior. They're forming committees. They're talking about systemic discrimination. The discussion is never about, okay, we're going to hold this individual accountable.
Okay. Pam, what do you think the one thing that could be done right now to show that the government or society, Canadian society is serious about this? What would it be?
They could open the books. Every police force, including the RCMP, have to open all of their police disciplinary records, investigations, commissions, inquiries on individual police officers, and then clean house with a zero tolerance policy for those that are regularly engaged in sexualized violence, police brutality, and acts of targeted racism. And that would clean house.
Pam Palmater in Toronto, the chair of Indigenous governance at Ryerson University, Calvin Lawrence in Ottawa, retired RCMP and Halifax police officer. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight.
You're welcome.
Thank you.